I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as the death toll from this week's massive strike on Kyiv edges upwards, we look at the pressure now being applied to President Zelensky's chief advisor over the anti-corruption bill that proved so controversial. Plus, we have our regular segment on resistance activities in the occupied territories, and we hear from Adélie on the ground in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 1st of August, 3 years and 160 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Memphis Barker and Dr. Jade McGlynn of the War Studies Department of King's College London. I started with the latest military updates from Ukraine. Let's start with those updates from that overnight attack Wednesday, Thursday. The death toll has tragically risen to 31 now, with 159 injured. Among the victims, we're told, was a school teacher, Natalia Gayova. Her brother and two sons in late teens and early 20s, I think, died alongside her. Her husband and youngest son survived. Imagine how they're feeling today. 3 police officers and 12 children were also among the injured. 35 people, including 5 children, still hospitalised as of yesterday evening, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said. And today has been declared a day of mourning in Kyiv. Flags going to be flown at half-mast on all municipal buildings. All entertainment events cancelled in the city for today. Just as a reminder, it was over 300 drones and 8 ballistic missiles that were fired to Ukraine yesterday, the vast majority at Kyiv. Now, responding to these attacks, Donald Trump said, Russia, I think it's disgusting what they're doing. I think what Russia's doing is very sad. Okay. He also said Steve Witkoff, his special envoy for the Middle East, is going to pay another visit to Russia after his current trip in Israel. He's in Israel at the moment. He's in Gaza, I believe. Donald Trump did not specify the dates or the agenda of Mr. Witkoff's visit to Russia. Now, in the 24 hours since that strike, further Russian attacks have killed 3, injured nearly 40. 72 drones were fired at the country. Most shot down, but 28 did reach their targets at 9 locations in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Otherwise, very little move on the ground. In his nightly address yesterday, President Zelensky said the Russian reports of taking the whole of Chasiv Yar in the Donbass were fake and disinformation. Yesterday, Russia's MOD did say they had taken the whole town. It is, and you never talk glibly about the loss of territory, but it is largely an academic exercise now talking about Chasiv Yar. There's nothing left really of the city. Russia holds most of the town, and they have had for months, the north and the east sectors in particular. But as the ISW says, the Institute for the Study of War, US-based think tank, they say Russian forces have taken 26 months to advance the 11 kilometres from the western boundary of Bakhmut, which Russian forces seized in May 2023, to where they currently are in Chasiv Yar. ISW also say that Russia has suffered significant personnel losses for these disproportionately small territorial gains through the ruins of Chasiv Yar. They say Russia has gained roughly 7.8 square kilometres of the roughly 10 square kilometres within Chasiv Yar's administrative boundaries. So they hold nearly 80% of the city there, but as I say, it is mostly a shell. Now, a very interesting report written by a very young and attractive journalist here by the name of Memphis Barker at The Telegraph. Russia's Far East nuclear submarine base appears to have been damaged by that tsunami that swept across the Pacific on Wednesday and hit the Pacific coast of Russia, according to satellite imagery obtained by the paper here. Now, the waves from that tsunami, triggered by the 8.8 magnitude earthquake, hit the Rybashi base in the Kamchatka Peninsula, which houses one of Russia's nuclear submarine bases in the Pacific Fleet. Now, a section of one of the piers has obviously bent away from its original position in this satellite imagery, possibly indicating that it's either totally detached from its moorings or very seriously damaged. These are images taken by the Umbra space satellite on Thursday morning. Now, it doesn't look like a submarine was moored alongside at the time of the impact. Experts have said the damage to the structure alone would have little military significance. Dr. Siddhartha Kushal at RUSI, speaking very widely on this. So have a look at his website. He's a very good chap. However, it has raised questions about whether the tsunami caused any further harm to the base. It was thought the base was hit about 15 minutes after the earthquake. So if it's powerful enough to move one of the piers, I think there are about 7 or 8 piers from the satellite imagery, but these are not insignificant pieces of infrastructure. They are there to support nuclear submarines or military submarines. So these are not insignificant things. One of them has very obviously taken a massive hit. We don't know if it caused any other damage as well. A couple more from me. The online media outlet Defence News has a piece. We'll put the link into the episode notes. It's interesting. It's talking about drones and Russian investment in them. So it says Russia specifically allocated 243 billion rubles, that's about $3 billion US, to drone manufacturing between 2022 and 25. It then says they've apportioned a further 112 billion rubles, $1.38 billion US, allocated for the next 3 years. Now, I was interested in that, not only because of the size of the number, but also that's half. So Russia is investing heavily in drones. We know that they are repackaging the Shahed drones they get from Iran. They're now calling them Geran drones if they are actually built inside Russia. They're getting a lot of stuff from North Korea as well. But I was surprised that marks change in the value of cash that they've put to one side for the drones. Now, this is in addition, I should say, and separate from the overall military spending, which makes up almost a third of government funding at the moment. It's worth noting, of course, Russia produced 2.5 times more drones in 2024 than it did in 2023. It's thought about 900 companies employing 7,000 people are involved in this sector of Russia's military procurement alone. But like I say, do go and have a look at the article and see what you think, because I was very surprised at this push for drones, which we know is going on, and yet the amount of money Russia's allocated to it is significantly down for the next 3 years. I wonder what that might mean. And then finally, for me, possibly a tad late, but the US has sanctioned firms connected to Iran's drone production industry. So the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control said yesterday it's imposed new sanctions on a global procurement network accused of supporting Iran's growing military drone program. These measures are going to target 5 companies and 1 individual based in Iran, China, Hong Kong and Taiwan, all allegedly involved in sourcing sensitive technology for the Iranian Aviation Manufacturing Company. That's an Iranian state-owned defence firm. So maybe a bit late, but good to see. However, as I say, Russia is now manufacturing basically Shaheds under the name of Geran in a number of sites across Russia. Therefore, what this sanctioning of Iran will do, we're not exactly sure. Would have been helpful if the last administration had taken that action. Anyway, so moving on to the diplomatic front, delighted to have Memphis back with us. Memphis, welcome once again to the pod. What have you been looking at specifically on the diplomatic front? What's caught your eye?
Thanks, Dom. We've just seen a very interesting press conference with Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko, where Putin is responding to the increasingly tough, increasingly vituperative tone from the US President Donald Trump. He's got one of his kind of classically cryptic lines that Putin's just said. He said, well, he's disappointed, but disappointment usually starts from having too high expectations in the first place. And whether Donald Trump did have too high expectations, whether he's asked too much, I think many would say he was asking comparatively little, and Putin has just given nothing at all. So I think we are watching live the kind of continuing breakdown of the relationship between President Trump and President Putin, which at the start of his term obviously had a quite different colour to it.
Sorry, can I jump in? So is Putin saying that Trump had too high an expectation of Putin?
Of progress for peace talks. He would want to go too fast. He's applying too much pressure. He's basically said we won't do anything under kind of force or threat of pressure. It's not going out too far in the same rough language that President Trump uses, but it is saying he's pushing too hard and he had too high expectations for what could be achieved at speed in this ongoing process. Obviously, Putin has been trying to drag out any peace negotiation, quote unquote, for months and months and months as his army pushes forward in Ukraine. So, for him to say you're pushing too hard and you had too much expectations, I think many would counter.
Do you think this is Putin defending his pal Medvedev? Because he and Trump had a war of words this week. We reported yesterday, Trump saying, I think it was something like Medvedev needs to watch his step or something like that. So is this responding to that, or is this Putin starting to lay the groundwork for another massive fudge? Because it's next Friday, August the 8th, when the 50 days are up and Trump wants to ceasefire, or else? Or it could be both. What do you think?
My view is probably a bit of both. I think he would stick up for Medvedev. Obviously, Trump's been tweeting at him and warning him to watch his mouth, as you say. Yeah. And I just see very little sense that anything is going to happen under that deadline. Putin seems to be responding to the threat of a deadline and going, well, we're not going to act in accordance with your timeline. Although this is, as I say, this happened a few minutes before we came in, so it'll take a bit more time to decipher and decode, as I'm sure the listeners will do. I wanted to just very quickly rattle through a couple of other things. Another one involving President Trump. Now, last night he announced the imposition of 25% tariffs on exports from India, and that's significantly higher than Pakistan, with whom he's increasingly warm relations. I think what I'd like to highlight here is that he also said there would be further unspecified penalties over India's purchasing of Russian gas. Now, we don't know what form that will take, what level that will be, but it's certainly a transparent threat, and you're already seeing some reaction on the part of the Indian state to the threat of secondary sanctions on it for purchasing Russian oil. You'll see that Indian state-owned refineries are already diversifying away from purchases of Russian crude. They're buying Azerbaijani or Nigerian oil. That's according to a report in Bloomberg from a couple of days ago. It just also seems that Europe's intensifying sanctions on this trade are having some kind of impact. So, whether it's enough to totally push India away from gobbling up as much of this Russian crude as it can remains to be seen. And I just wanted to highlight the reaction of a senior politician and well-known author, Shashi Tharoor. Right after this was announced, he said, well, look, he's not specified a penalty. It could be 35 or 45% tariff. We don't know. If you're talking about 100% penalty, then you are going to destroy our trade, he said. It could just be a bargaining tactic. And he adds, and I think that's very interesting, he says, listen, let's be unequivocal. India's relationship with Russia is rooted in decades of strategic partnership, particularly in defence and energy. To suggest that India must abandon these long-standing ties under duress is an affront to our sovereignty. So there's clearly a reaction against the pressures that Trump is putting on the government of Narendra Modi, but a significant tariff might see it go even further in diversifying away from Russian crude. Let's see. Good news. Germany's agreed to provide 2 more Patriot batteries and launchers to Ukraine.
So a battery being 3 or 4 launchers.
So apparently the process will be completed in October. Now, Germany's already sent 3 of these batteries, and until the middle of this month, Boris Pistorius, the defence minister, was saying, listen, we can't provide any more. We know we don't have enough ourselves. This appears to be a U-turn. Trump has obviously changed his tune somewhat on the delivery of Patriots to Ukraine, and it's a kind of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, as in the US have told Germany, look, you'll now be first in line for the latest Patriot batteries. There's a long queue for the new systems, and Germany moves right to the top, and in exchange for that, it's giving 2 of its systems to Ukraine, the value of which we all know to be extremely high, and preventing more deaths from these awful waves of strikes we're seeing almost every night. And lastly, a little bit of mopping up from the reversal of President Zelensky's controversial corruption reforms. There's an interesting piece in The Economist this week where the author says that this has actually really damaged the reputation of Zelensky's chief of staff, Andriy Yermak, within presidential circles. So it's not just the public who are chanting against him on the streets, as we saw, but it's had certainly caused him some trouble in the place where he has the closest allies, which is within the presidential palace. This piece goes on to say that resolving the crisis, the Deputy Prime Minister, Fedorov, has been gaining some credit for that. He's been seen as a good negotiator, so his star might be, at the same time, somewhat on the rise.
Thanks, Memphis. Now, I was talking about the latest terrible attack on Kyiv earlier. Let's hear a short dispatch from Adélie, who's just arrived in the country for a week of reporting and is currently in the capital.
Hi Dom, I'm standing in Veselia Kuchera Street in the district of Sviatoshinsky, and behind me you can hear the trucks clearing out the rubble from the apartment building where the rocket strike fell on July 31st. It's an apartment building in a residential area. It's one of the two areas that have been most hit in central Kyiv. And that's because around here there is some critical industrial infrastructure that is often being targeted, such as the National Aviation Institute, that's not far, as well as a small airport nearby. So the trucks and the emergency services are working really hard, peeling out broken windows from the walls, gathering debris from the ground. There's a lot of people, probably like maybe 100, a mix of firemen, emergency services, police, but also local residents. It's a 9-story apartment building, and it's the end of it that has been entirely destroyed by the strike. And there's literally barely anything left to the end of the building. The area has been mostly cleared out, and you have some ruins of the hollowed out apartments. You can still see people's wallpapers on the walls. There's a clothes rack where I can see coats, a pink purse that's just waiting here, ready to be picked up to go out. And inside the blasted out doors, in the darkness of the building, I can see the high vis of the emergency services, who are either clearing out things or assessing the damage. So the residents who are lined up in front of the building entrance, they're being lent helmets by the rescue services and allowed in to grab whatever they want. That can be important documents, photographs, but also any sort of belonging they can find and that they want to take with them. I've seen an older man carrying his Hoover. There was a woman and her adult son bringing back bags of linen. Someone's carrying a TV, a bike. And on the ground floor just across from me, just about 10 meters away from me, there's an elderly couple getting clothes out of a wardrobe. There's just no wall around the flat anymore, so you can see everything, including the Virgin Mary's poster on the wall. There are also a couple of guys in military fatigues, and I've been told that the army often helps out in clearing out the debris whenever there's a strike. But these guys, they're not here with a unit. They're clearly helping out relatives pack whatever they can get from the apartments, going up in the staircase, packing and repacking bags. The rocket flew into the 5th floor, and so the upper levels of the building are very empty because structurally no one's really sure whether the building is still sound. Across the street from me as well, there's 2 stories left on the very end. It's like a rectangular unit peeking out. Everything around it has been destroyed. And I've been told a man was trapped in that kitchen for more than 3 hours, and he was completely locked in because of the debris that had fallen in on all sides from his apartment, and he managed to come out alive. That's a photo you may have seen in the news reports. In front of the area that's been taped out where the ruins start, there's a pile of teddy bears and flowers that people have put in memory of the people who have died in this strike. So far, and it's difficult to know whether that's the final count, 28 people have died on this strike 2 days ago, including 5 children. And in front of me, there's a couple of ladies bringing another bouquet of flowers to add to the pile, and they're clearly very emotional. I wonder whether they may have lived here, or whether they may have had family or friends living here. So I'm here with Ed from Fire Aid. Tell us about the organisation. How come we ended up meeting here in front of the strike location in Kyiv?
So Fire Aid is a British charity that has been supporting the state emergency services of Ukraine since 2012. Fire Aid's initial mission in Ukraine was one to do with road safety, supplying training and equipment to state emergency service workers in post-crash response. After the full-scale invasion, Fire Aid then stepped up their support for Ukraine and has facilitated the donation of 149 fire trucks and over 220,000 pieces of equipment.
That's great. And so you've been on the podcast before. You spoke with David a while ago.
Yes, so I spoke with David after the Kakhovka Dam had been destroyed. So I actually personally come from a background in flood and lifeboat rescue. So I was supporting an organisation which was delivering flood rescue support to Ukrainian rescuers in Kherson during the flooding there.
And tell us what's going on here. There's a lot of noise around us. It's very impressive what's going on.
So There is a large amount of Ukrainian rescuers from different departments. The Mobile Rescue Centre team are currently removing the hazardous windows that are partially destroyed to make the building safe.
Yeah, so they're literally taking out the lining of the windows with like shards of broken glass everywhere and just throwing it out on the ground. So we've stepped away by a few meters along where all of the rescue missions are in order to avoid any debris, and they're just cutting things out and just throwing it up in front of us, a few meters in front of us, right?
Yeah, pretty much. So if they don't do this, heavy winds or the storms that we're experiencing at the moment could just dislodge some of these things and they could fall out. So it's better to remove everything, remove the rubble, remove the windows. So if somebody is walking around here, they're not going to have something fall on their head.
And this is a particularly deadly strike. It's led to a day of mourning here in Kyiv. You go to a lot of these locations where strikes happen. Is what we're seeing fairly standard, or is there anything particularly notable here?
So in the last 2 months, we have noticed an increase in missile attacks on residential buildings. This building is a fairly typical building. You can see it's manufactured with concrete prefabricated parts. So it's like building with Jenga, basically. So the concrete here can be made of aerated concrete or low-quality concrete. So when the building collapses, instead of breaking up into large pieces, it also crumbles. But also the mechanism of the collapse being a missile, that also does a lot of damage. So I think the total number of fatalities is higher than we've seen recently because of how the alarm process happened. So the previous attacks, the missiles that arrived were still in the original alarm, so people were aware. But this was different because we had an alarm cancel 1 hour before the missiles arrived. So the new alarm only came just before the missiles actually arrived. So a lot less people were then likely to go back to a shelter because they may have already spent the last 6 hours in the shelter. And often it could be something like a MiG taking off, which doesn't guarantee a rocket to Kyiv, or this area, a residential building in a nondescript neighbourhood, you would probably think is relatively safe. But I think that is what led to the large amount of fatalities in this building. Just people didn't expect it to be here. And even people who went to the basement wouldn't have survived because the basement had completely been destroyed because the rocket went straight in and down into basement level. These are not showerheads. They don't explode in a building and maybe take out a couple of floors. They take out the top of the building all the way to the basement, and anyone who's still inside has a very low chance of survival.
Thank you for explaining what's been going on to us here.
And now over to Francis for our regular fortnightly segment with Dr. Jade McGlynn on resistance activities in the occupied territories.
Jade, welcome back to the podcast. A pleasure as ever. Last time that we had you on, we started our conversation in a broader sense before talking about some of the updates of resistance in the occupied territories. And so wanted to ask by asking you about technology and control over communications in the occupied territories, because I know there's been some developments in this field.
Yeah, there have, and unfortunately not in the right direction. I think a few of the things I'm going to talk about today are kind of link into a broader argument that I think people who are interested in this field should be aware of, that there were things that were possible in 2022 and 2023 that are really not possible in 2025 because the situation is just so much more just Orwellian, really. And that's such an overused word, and it's such a shame because it was designed for some of the things I'm about to talk about. One of the major changes, in fact, just yesterday, occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia announced that they would be moving all government communications onto a messenger system that's called MAX. So it's a Russian-developed, state-controlled messaging platform that's being officially adopted by occupation authorities, occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia, and Mariupol. The post-2022 territories increasingly live under a much harsher form of occupation, I think, though that is in no way to dismiss the harshness of the occupation in Donetsk and Luhansk either. The Max Messenger, it's being marketed obviously as a patriotic alternative to Western apps, most of which are blocked, and also to Telegram. So they're moving very quickly as well. Like the transition is due to take 1 week. What does Max enable? So state surveillance, metadata capture of communications, monitoring administrative staff, anyone who engages with the occupation governance. Of course, reduces reliance on Telegram, which although the FSB do have a backdoor, as has been, so no communications on Telegram are secure. This will make it just so much easier for them, really. And it's part of a broader issue that's happening. So there's also another program that people in the occupied territories refer to as Rubin. Essentially, phones that are sold in the occupied territories come preloaded with a software package that these people are calling Rubin. And it allows for just total surveillance of whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, and if you're trying to not be seen going somewhere. Phones in Russia are not preloaded with whatever this software is. So it again draws attention to a point I try to make relatively often, which is that as grim and repressive as Russia, the situation there is not in any way comparable to the occupied territories, especially when we consider that there are 144 million Russians and they're not getting anything like the level of kind of resources for surveillance that a territory of, excluding Crimea, 3.6 million Ukrainians are in the occupied territories. That's the best estimate of how many Ukrainians are left there. Before the occupation, there were about 9 million people living in the region, just so we have a good idea of the sort of population displacement that has occurred. What does Rubin do? Well, again, it's facial recognition, it's tracking of metadata, it's listening to what you say. It's known that in Zaporizhia region, during curfew, when you may or may not be sleeping, maybe you're a night owl, there are cars, FSB cars, that drive around even villages, and they are set up with various aspects of the Rubin system, and they're able to listen. They're able to listen and track what's happening inside homes to see which communications devices are connected to routers, make sure there are no communications devices that they don't already have, like on their system. They're able to check who you're speaking to. And I think this is the really worrying aspect, because right now, in theory, I would not do, please, nobody do this, but in theory, you could just walk into a local Kyiv style Vodafone Ukraine shop, buy a Ukrainian SIM, and message somebody who is in the occupied territories on Telegram. Now, for lots of reasons, you shouldn't just do that, but you can do it. Whereas now, once Max is rolled out, that's not going to be possible. You're essentially not going to be able to talk to anybody who's not in Russia or Belarus without drawing incredible amounts of surveillance and indeed maybe risking your life. So it's going to be a huge escalation. And it's also going to cause huge amounts of problems in terms of keeping even those emotional kind of familial divides. Obviously, it's presumed that people who are trusted by the regime, who have family in Ukraine or abroad, the context will be there that the FSB wouldn't target them. So they're not necessarily banning people from talking to people in other countries. It's just that if you did want to talk to somebody in another country and you didn't have a reason that the FSB liked for that, then you're in trouble. So the situation's escalating considerably, unfortunately, in terms of technological control. One element I would also add is just that after curfews in the occupied territories, pretty much nobody goes out, because if men, for example, are caught out after curfew, they will just be immediately forcibly mobilised and sent into a meat storm. For women, you risk other types and forms of punishment. So in general, after curfew, everything is dead, and it provides that backdrop for the FSB to drive around in their creepy cars and listen to everything. So that's what the peace that so many people who just want the war to end, as if nobody else does, that's what peace looks like for the people of Mariupol and Melitopol and Berdyansk.
One question that I have on this, Jade, is do we have a sense of the number of people who are involved in the FSB in terms of this kind of surveillance work? Are we talking hundreds of people? Are we talking thousands?
We're talking thousands, many, many thousands. The FSB is, of course, they are the main body dealing with this, but you also have GRU, you also have Rosgvardia, the National Guard, you also have Kadyrivtsi performing certain functions. You also have a lot of volunteer movement, so things that kids in Russia are encouraged to do, and they do for extra benefits. And I don't know if you had this, but at school we had this thing for a while, then it disappeared, called like citizenship studies, and it was some absolute nonsense. So it's like that, but evil rather than just nonsense. And these groups, in particular, like the All-Russian National Front, a few others, they were pretty instrumental in the rollout of the satellites. So the Ruski Mir satellites, which are they destroyed, obviously. One of the first things they do when they come in anywhere, the Russians, and occupy, is in the first sort of 24, 48 hours, destroy all connection to Ukrainian information networks, mobile networks, etc. And then after a while, they started to install these satellites called Ruski Mir, and they're television satellites, and they have lots of completely normal things on them, like lots of children's television, of course, to encourage people to have it installed, lots of sort of channels that perhaps more elderly residents might enjoy. But they also have certain specific channels that are only available on the occupied territories. So even if you were in Russia, you couldn't access them because you would need to have the satellite specifically installed. And this started happening around the end of, probably around 2023, it started happening properly. And they sent around installation brigades, and there were, of course, threats as well. But if you wanted connection to a television, it had to be via this satellite, and to my understanding, that is still the case. And especially since they can track all of your internet connections, what you're watching, whether or not you're watching something you shouldn't be watching. If you want visual entertainment, then you're under pressure. Why did they do that? Apart from the obvious reasons of wanting to push their narratives and disconnect people from Ukraine. Well, I think the fact that there are channels that are only available on the occupied territories, regional news channels, and as in Russia, most people who don't want to think about the war, we've seen a big shift essentially, both among Russians but also people in the occupied territories, towards really focusing on local news to distract oneself or just to stay within one's cocoon. And the local news channels, they have different variations of the sort of propaganda you would see in the official channels. So if you go on to RIA Novosti Zaporizhzhia, for example, you'll read lines that are fit for a Russian audience, but actually don't really suit people in the occupied territories who obviously understand that it's total nonsense and the economy stopped working or whatever. And so the channels that are only available via Ruski Mir satellite, the narratives are broadly the same. Russia's great, Ukraine is awful, but they're much more fear-focused. So there's much more about finding drug addicts and terrorists, by which they mean heroic, brave Ukrainian partisans, and how they're punished, and this constant idea that Ukraine is not coming back. It's forgotten about you. But if it did come back, they would kill and torture you all for taking Russian passports, because obviously everybody was forced basically to take a Russian passport if they needed to access even the most basic type of care or get healthcare for their child. So it's more targeted at the local population than the kind of official stuff, which is for Russians to read so they can be like, oh yeah, look, it's great, everyone's really happy with her, and I can just carry on ignoring this war and pretending it's not happening.
Well, thank you very much for that overview of, it always seems to get worse the more one learns about the occupied territories, doesn't it? It's really very dispiriting, but thank you for your insights on it. What ramifications are some of these developments having on some of the latest updates and the frequency of them, Jade, in terms of resistance activity?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because though I don't want to link it just to the technological issues, because they're still largely being rolled out, there has been a lot more activity from the Ukrainian armed forces recently on the occupied territory. So the Ukrainian armed forces on the territory of Ukraine, not the partisans. And I think as a result of some of that activity, you have seen, well, no, I don't want to say as a result of, it's as a result of Russian absolute barbarity, let's be very clear. But lots of people on the occupied territories do act as eyes and ears for the Ukrainian armed forces to help them with their strikes. I think the Russians are very aware of that, to put it mildly. And there's really a period happening right now, which is reflected by the technological changes too, of really trying to crack down on these areas and on any forms of resistance. So there's, over the last couple of weeks, there's been a drop in the number of activities. So 6 confirmed violent resistance actions across sabotage, arson and assassinations, 4 of which took place in the temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories and 2 occurred within the Russian Federation. So one was in Skadovsk in Kherson region on the 17th of July when anti-Smersh fighters targeted a power station that supplied the 22nd Army Corps of the Russian Federation and disrupted the energy support for key Russian military infrastructure. On the next day in Mariupol, part which needs, I think at this point, no introduction, sadly, partisans carried out arson of a vehicle, of an occupation vehicle. So it's a pretty standard kind of continuation of partisans in Mariupol and their focus on vehicle sabotage, especially in urban centres, in part because it's an activity that causes disruption, but is also maybe more possible in urban areas. The most notable strike, arguably, was on the 24th of July in Berdyansk, where the Srok group killed an FSB agent. So pretty rare, pretty bold operation in the heart of occupied Zaporizhia. Normally Srok do more, they like to track their hunters, Srok. I think that would be the best way of saying it. And then a few days later, on the 27th of July, Atesh partisans damaged a railway relay cabinet between Chaplinka and Novoyelksivka in Kherson region, which disrupted Russian transport infrastructure in Kherson Oblast. And then inside Russia, the Atesh also blew up a relay cabinet in Tula, which is to the southwest of Moscow region. It's about 6 hours drive, if memory serves me correctly. And then the Legion of Free Russia, so they're Russian citizens, they're based in Ukraine. I think people know quite a lot about them, about Caesar and some of the other Russians. So they're not the Russian Volunteer Corps, they're a different group, but they claimed that they destroyed a communication tower in Ryazan Oblast, which is also to the south of Moscow and the birthplace of a very interesting poet named Yesenin, who I went through a phase of just absolutely devouring everything he wrote. A lot of his poems were about hanging out with prostitutes during the revolution. It ended with him killing himself, as it always does with so many excellent poets.
They have a particular talent for that, don't they, poets? Anyway.
Especially in Russia. But there are also some graffiti and other elements as well, so non-violent aspects of resistance, including in Luhansk, where there's been seemingly an increase in leaflet distribution from a new movement. But a lot of what's going on, to be honest, is about documenting Russian military activity and information gathering. We've long seen a shift away from the sort of perhaps the more Instagrammable elements because it's not realistic. And that brings me to something that I need to say, and that, to be honest with you, I don't really want to say, and I could have said it a long, long time ago, but I really deeply respect the listeners of your podcast and how engaged they are with this war so long in, and how hungry they are as well for information and context about it. So I think given that I have now taken up a more regular position of providing information on the occupied territories, I feel a bit of a responsibility, even though hopefully it won't, but it may sound like a controversial thing to say. In the context of Ukraine's resistance, especially in the occupied territories, we obviously have to be very careful about what we put out. First of all, so as not to mislead people, but also because sometimes there are things that one cannot share because we are talking about a deeply, deeply unpleasant place to live at the moment. As a result, we often as well don't have that much information about the occupied territories. If you don't speak Russian or Ukrainian, if you don't have the context, you can explain that context to you. Normally people who are from those areas originally, it's really easy to get confused. There's lots of mistakes even that I've made and got confused. But as a result, I think sometimes Western audiences naturally want to celebrate what they can see. Symbols, slogans, social media campaigns. But the truth is that really the real resistance, it doesn't look like that. Most of it doesn't even look like the updates I'm giving you. The real resistance is quiet, anonymous, it's boring, it's sitting on vehicles, it's sitting on park benches. It doesn't come with photos, it doesn't come with merchandise, it doesn't come with slick websites, it doesn't come with billboards. These are people who are operating inside the most dangerous environments imaginable. They're risking their lives to help others to survive. They're not trying to go viral. And yet, at the same time, there are some high-profile campaigns and movements that present extremely polished narratives of the occupied territories in ways that attract headlines, funding, I'm sure, and policy attention, and often from very well-meaning people abroad who naturally and quite kindly really want to help and are heartbroken to hear what's happening in the occupied territories. But I would say that the distance between some of the images that are shared and the on-the-ground reality is far greater than it might appear. And in some cases, which is why I'm saying this disconnect has consequences for trust, for effectiveness, and also for the safety of civilians in the occupied territories. Some people I know who are very active and connected into the resistance have very bravely raised concerns about this dynamic of putting out photographs or certain stunts that are said to be from the occupied territories, but that are actually either not, perhaps in some cases, careful obviously what I say, or are encouraging civilians in the occupied territories to do risky things that they would not be encouraged to do if they were dealing with professionals. And really, this is a territory that professionals should be dealing with. So, not me. And Francis, I'm afraid not you. Maybe Dom in a previous career, but some of those who've raised this issue have been isolated for doing so, though they are saying something that pretty much everybody in this area knows to be true, that it's not possible to have civilian activism within the occupied territories. It's like talking about having civilian activism within a concentration camp. And I want to just make sure that those people, to the extent I have any platform, that those people are not left alone for telling the truth. And you have this wonderful podcast, and it gives some platform to hopefully then, by me saying something, hopefully it can also then protect them a bit. Because supporting Ukraine is about being discerning. It means asking hard questions when something looks a bit too polished or a bit too convenient. I get that branding has helped, and the information war is an incredibly important part. I am in no way dismissive of that, but this war is not a brand. Occupation is not some kind of photo stage set. And we have to be guided ultimately by accountability, especially as we live in safety, not aesthetics. And I say this just to reiterate that, say this as someone who believes in Ukraine, who believes in the resistance and in the power of international solidarity with Ukraine. But that solidarity does have to be responsible, and we have to make sure that we're not inadvertently harming the very people we mean to protect.
Thank you very much, Jade, for your reflections on that really important and underexplored aspect of the occupied territories. Thank you as ever, Jade, for your time.
Thank you.
I want to bring something to your attention. Interesting, quirky. You could write it off as it's all made up. It's not made up, but I've got very little evidence for what I'm about to tell you. However, I've been looking for, any signs really, any noise coming out from inside Russia about signs of resistance. And I have been looking at, if you believe his name, a chap called Nikita, a former soldier from Krasnodar, so just to the east of Ukraine. A soldier turned artist. His alias is Svoy Patsan, which translates roughly as one of the lads or our guy. So he's thought to be an ethnic Russian, aged about 30, 35-ish. He fought in Ukraine, possibly as part of the Wagner group. He, in his sort of TikTok, Instagram and other channels, he speaks highly of Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's very critical of Putin and General Valery Gerasimov, who's the head of Russia's armed forces. This guy seems to have served for 6 months or so. That figure is bandied around, and obviously 6 months is notable for us who've been paying attention, because that's what the convict contract was. Yevgeny Prigozhin went and emptied the prisons, said, come and serve with the Wagner group, and if you survive 6 months, you are free. So this interesting fellow. Now, he's speaking out. He's got a lot of channels, Instagram, TikTok. We'll put links in the episode notes today, Telegram as well. His latest video got about 100,000 views in just a few hours before it was blocked by the authorities. But despite that ban, he is getting traction. His profile seems to be growing. Now, to be clear, he is no democratic liberal hero. His lyrics are infused with explicit Russian kind of chauvinism, intolerance. He reflects the ethnic and social tensions that permeate Russian society, but often concealed by state propaganda. We kind of get a hint of it every now and again, but we see very little of it. But he is an interesting example of the types of perhaps unexpected resistance that we occasionally get glimpses of. I'm not trying to blow this into anything that it's not, but it is interesting to see these and report on them when we're able to. So he could be said to represent the sort of mainstream political majority in Russia more than the liberal diaspora opposition outside the country and what little opposition we occasionally hear from inside the country. He seems to hold the same values as a lot of Russians, kind of xenophobia, nationalism, disdain for democratic norms, but importantly, he diverges from the regime in one crucial aspect, in that he believes Russia's being led in the wrong direction, and he thinks he has the moral right to say so because of his personal sacrifice on the battlefield. So through his work, through his various sort of music videos and all the rest of it, there's a number of core themes. One is his very kind of radical, outspoken criticism of Vladimir Putin. He expresses deep distrust and contempt toward and for Putin. That's the central thread across many of his songs and Telegram posts. Now, this distinguishes him from other Russian opposition artists who, if they break cover at all, it's very cautious, very ambiguous. But Nikita's aggressive approach possibly, and I underline that, possibly signals the erosion of Putin's legitimacy among younger Russians and in particular veterans of the war. Now, he also expresses disdain for, as I said, Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov, and a lot of his music reflects the frustration and disillusionment amongst Russian soldiers regarding the way they were led in the war, the way they are being led in the war. He also says, this is Nikita, he says Prigozhin's assassination was a murder ordered by Putin, and stresses that Russians have not forgotten what happened there and that it will be remembered and come up again in due course. He contrasts frontline soldiers, his experience, with law enforcement personnel, whom he portrays as idle and privileged. He says he reflects widespread resentment amongst the veteran community who returned to civilian life in Russia only to have, legal troubles, police brutality, and that kind of thing. And he says he has a voice. He is a voice for those who question why better equipped forces, like the police, are not deployed to the front. Now, many of his songs centre on the opposition between the young and middle-aged Russians who are off fighting in the war and the old-school Soviet-era elite who started it but are too old or infirm to participate. His central message is that young Russians are being sacrificed by a bunch of old men concerned only with clinging to personal power rather than securing the country's future. So, why does, and indeed does any of this matter? And if so, why does it matter? Well, I think for the first time in, a couple of decades, I guess, sacred political taboos, chief amongst them this criticism of Putin, are being broken in public through music and cultural expression. Now, his protest style echoes that of the late Soviet era, when discontent was channeled through the arts, as open speech was impossible. It's likely that he's giving voice to sentiments held by millions of Russians who are too afraid to speak openly. We have occasionally seen criticism of Putin, but it's very guarded and almost state-sanctioned criticism, just to let off a bit of steam. But that's not what this guy's doing. Please don't think I'm putting him in that pile. This seems to be genuine, but I don't know who this guy is. I'm just looking at some of his content. We will put links in the episode notes. Go and have a look, see what you think. But this is out there. So do you think this is the state letting off steam and allowing a little bit of frustration to come out? Or linking that a veteran who, in his eyes has legitimacy to say these things, openly critical of Putin and Gerasimov, openly supportive of Prigozhin. If this is the state, they're playing with some quite hot topics here, which lends me to lean on the side, not totally, but lean on the side of thinking this is possibly genuine, in which case it's a very interesting addition to the subject of resistance to Russia in the occupied territories or here in Russia itself. Anyway, do go and have a look at the links and Nikita's content and his art. See what you think. Let us know if this marks a diversion, if this is going to be stamped out. I suppose the only way we'll know is keep tracking his TikTok and Instagram, what have you, and see if he suddenly goes very quiet or changes his tune to see what the authorities think of it, if indeed they know who he is. But I thought I'd bring that to your attention. I am not able to offer great analysis on it because it's so mired in confusion and it's very opaque, but I think it was interesting and hence bring it to you for your view. Memphis, got any final thoughts to leave our listeners with for the week?
Well, just following on from Adélie's conversation with Mstislav Chernov earlier this week, I just wanted to also urge everyone who can to get out and see 2,000 Meters to Andriivka, which is released in cinemas today. I've never seen anything like it in a cinema. It brings you closer to the front line than I personally thought would be possible. And we've seen so much footage, me, Dom, Francis, everyone who works on the pod, just constant clips on YouTube, on Telegram. What this film does is it transforms those clips. You see that the people in those, we learn who they are. We get to spend time with them. We understand them as humans. And that puts into context the extraordinary demands placed on these men. And to say it's a kind of film that you'll never forget, I know that's a big thing to say, but it's certainly the case for me. And both as a piece of reportage and as a piece of documentary filmmaking, it's an extraordinary work, the pacing, the structure, and it really honours the memory of the soldiers whose helmet camera footage forms the bulk of the film, and many of whom die in the progress of making it. So yes, do go if you can.
Thanks. So as you say, Adélie interviewed the director, so go and have a listen to that. But when you say it's released today, is it streamed or is it
in cinemas?
Okay, in cinemas. Just in the UK or
UK this week? I think it's the US next week. A couple of cinemas in London, maybe 4 or 5 are showing it. I've seen it earlier, but I'm taking some more people to go and see it tomorrow again. I mean, somewhat. I spoke to the director too, and he says it's quite a demand we make on the audience because you are essentially taking them to war. But I do think it is such an important work that everyone who can stomach it should go.
And why, just to finish, why important? Because there is the line between it being interesting because so rarely we normal people are so rarely able to access those positions in those situations. But you say it's more than that.
Well, I mean, I really think that it no longer is just men with guns going through a ravaged landscape and fighting and killing Russians. It is, for me, it is fully fleshed humans who he's talking to about university, about smoking, about their wives, in dugouts as the missiles are falling. And so the pain, really, of the loss is conveyed in a way that even from covering this war from afar or in Ukraine, I just think it's an important thing to keep making that case. And I think Mr. Chernov was wanting the film to be seen by as wide an audience as possible, including people who are in positions of power, to understand the demands made, that these aren't just men and meters and distance, that these are real lives. And I know that's an obvious thing to say, but the film itself is kind of like a memorial rather than just access to the front line, which is extraordinary. I mean, absolutely extraordinary, but it is a memorial for the men who died fighting that counteroffensive.
Well, thanks, Memphis. As I said, we do dial in. We lift ourselves up to have a look at the bigger picture and the context, so we then try and dial in, which is why, of course, it's very difficult to zone in on individuals each day, but that's why I mentioned Natalia Gayova, the school teacher who was killed in yesterday's strike, her brother and 2 sons with her. You do have to dial into the personal individual stories to bring this home. So thank you. 2,000 Meters to Andriivka, out tonight. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.